quick response, Bill, and then we'll have some final thoughts from you both.
Well, I have here Richard Muller's massive 4-volume history of post-Reformational Reformed Dogmatics. And anyone who thinks that Reformed Dogmatics is simply read out of Scripture doesn't know the history of Reformed theology. These volumes are permeated with theological constructs, philosophical models, philosophical principles that shape and guide Reformed dogmatics. And I've given examples of these already. God's necessity. There's nothing in Scripture that says that God exists in every possible world, rather than just in this world. God's timelessness. There's nothing in Scripture that proves that God transcends time rather than endures throughout all time. God's spacelessness. Again, there's nothing in Scripture that says that God transcends space rather than exists every point in space. Or the simplicity of God. Certainly God doesn't have physical parts, but you can't prove scripturally that God's essence is existence, that God doesn't have distinct properties. And yet all of these are affirmed by Reformed theologians who took over from the medieval scholastics, the Roman Catholic doctrine of God, lock, stock, and barrel, including those attributes that I just mentioned.
Bill, let's look at a few responses. Wintry Knight has had a blog for a long time. He said, quote,
Yes.
If I could boil down the mistake that James White makes to one sentence, it would be to say that he comes to the text of the Bible with a philosophical presupposition, determinism. Mm-hmm. And this causes him to misinterpret the plain meaning of the text as a whole. And this misinterpretation isn't about peripheral teachings of the Bible. His embrace of God as the cause of moral evil means that he denies the goodness of God, a basic Christian doctrine. And this is compounded by his embrace of double predestination, although that was not the topic of the debate. Christians shouldn't let a philosophy, determinism, override the plain meaning of Scripture. Determinism is man's philosophy. It's a Greek philosophy that existed centuries before Christ. Bill, what do you think about what Wintry Knight says here?
I agree with Wintry Knight. I have said in the past, Kevin, that the man who claims to have no need for philosophy is the man who is most apt to be deceived by it. Now, I said that of Stephen Hawking, but I think it could equally be said of James White. Claiming to have no philosophy, he imposes unwittingly on the text his own philosophy of universal divine determinism, and he misunderstands the important role of philosophy in shaping and guiding Reformed theology itself.
Wintry Knight also says, James White was also clearly unfamiliar with the philosophy of religion of his own Reformed tradition, and especially with the history of the development of Reformed theology. Craig was able to correct him by showing him the books on Reformed Dogmatics and explain the historical antecedents of Reformed thought. Bill, that's when you pulled out that big book.
That's right. The 4-volume history of post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics by Richard Muller, which I have consulted in connection with my own systematic philosophical theology. And I've been writing for the last several months on the attributes of God. And in my work, Kevin, I first explore what is the biblical basis for certain of the divine attributes. And what I found so often, Kevin, is that the biblical data are underdeterminative, that it's frustrating. You can't prove from the Bible exactly what God's attribute is. So I gave several examples in the conversation with James White. The attribute of necessity or necessary existence. I would love to have a scriptural proof text to show that God exists necessarily in every possible world. The medievals appealed to Exodus 3:14, I am that I am. But commentators seem to agree that at most that would suggest God's eternal existence, and that's not the same thing as God's broadly, logically necessary existence, that God exists in every possible world. Or take divine eternity. The Bible is ambiguous as to whether God's eternity means that God is timeless or whether God is infinite throughout all time. Or again, the attribute of God's relationship to space. Is God omnipresent in the sense that he transcends space altogether, but is active at every point in space? Or does God actually in some way fill space itself? Or the attribute of divine simplicity. We all agree that as a spiritual being, God has no physical parts. He's not put together out of pieces that could come apart. But that doesn't imply that God doesn't have distinct properties, or that God has no potentiality, or that God's essence is existence. And yet, Reformed Dogmatics borrows from medieval Catholic philosophy the doctrines of divine necessity, timelessness, spacelessness, and simplicity. It's wholesale reproduced in Reformed Dogmatics. And James White would be very hard-pressed to give any sort of biblical justification for that interpretation of the doctrine of God. This is a synoptic or synergistic working together of biblical data and theological reflection to try to determine what God's attributes are like.